everybody, and welcome to this session, Launch Vic Strategy 2021 to 2024. My name's Kate Cornick and I'm the CEO of Launch Vic, and I'm absolutely delighted to be with you today. As we always do, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands upon which we are meeting. For me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the tens of thousands of years of entrepreneurship and innovation that has led this wonderful land through many transformations. It's also a great pleasure to be here today on the final day of DIF, the Digital Innovation Festival run by the Victorian Government. I'd like to give a big shout out to Kathy Coultas and her team for all the work that they've done to bring together such a fabulous festival in very unusual circumstances, as we are all used to online. The purpose of today is to talk about Launch Vic strategy. We've undergone a series of transformation. Last year, we got a new board. We had the government give us some significant funding through the 2020-2021 budget handed down in November last year. And since that time, we've been working on exactly what we're going to do for the next few years. And I'm delighted to be able to share that with you today. But before I begin, I'd like to just touch on what Launch Vic's job is and what the Victorian ecosystem is doing. So Launch Vic, for those of you that don't know, is the state government startup agency, and our purpose is to drive the long-term success of Victoria's startup sector. The startup sector can mean lots of things to lots of people, but for us, it means we're helping those technology-driven, innovative companies that are disrupting markets and aiming for global domination. We're not here to support small businesses. We're here to support those unicorns and potential unicorns, the companies and founders with huge ambitions to grow billion-dollar companies and create thousands of jobs. It doesn't mean to say that small businesses aren't really important, but we acknowledge the great work of Small Business Victoria in supporting that community. For those high growth, technology driven, innovative companies, we recognise that you're on a special trajectory. You're higher risk than most other sectors. You've got a very strong chance of failure, but you also have needs around investment and growth that are very unique to these sorts of businesses. And that's exactly what we're set up to do. And in doing that, we will drive our long-term success. So growing the ecosystem means many things to many people. And the good news about Launch Vic since we came into inception in 2016 was that we were often asked that growing the ecosystem, I was often asked questions like, what does growing the ecosystem mean? And how do you, why is it called an ecosystem? It seems a bit strange. Well, nowadays, the word ecosystem is prolific. It's widely used. Everybody understands it. And that's, it means there are many, many facets to growing a startup. It's not a simple input and output connection. So for us, growing the ecosystem is exemplified by this diagram. What we want to do is activate entrepreneurs at the very top of the funnel. And so that is about getting people with great ideas and helping them to start a startup. One of the things we know about Victoria's ecosystem is that there are about 350 startups per million population, and that's significantly lower than other global ecosystems. Typically, world-leading ecosystems will have around about 1,000 startups per million population. So we recognise that there is a lot of work that we need to do to encourage people to be entrepreneurial. We certainly think that Victorians are highly entrepreneurial. We don't think there's an issue with the entrepreneuriality of our citizens. But what we do see is that there's a risk aversion to people taking the plunge to to create a startup. Whether that is someone who is leaving university and umming and ahhing about whether they want to follow their dream of setting up a business or get that safe job at PwC or wherever else it may be, or whether it's someone who is in their mid-career stepping out of a safe, well-paid job with a mortgage and having to take the plunge and weighing up whether they can afford to start up, or whether it's someone who's lost their job and we recognize the very challenging times we find ourselves in, and they're searching for their next job and are forced into generating their own company. We want to be there to help you, and it's why we support pre-accelerator programs in particular to help capture these people and help them on a journey so they've got a greatest chance of success. Then, of course, we want to support those startups to grow. And that's through programs that are going to help them learn all the basics of running a company through to understanding hiring in a high growth environment. And of course, that ever important question of investments. Whether you're a bootstrap company or whether you're looking for venture capital, you have to get money into the business. And that may be through an investment avenue like venture capital and angel investments. It might also be through product market fit and generating revenues. But we want to make sure you've got every chance of being a successful business, that you're not constrained by your by funding, and that is obviously an issue for many companies. So once your startup is off and away, you've got a little bit of seed funding, you've got some potential revenues, you've got product market fit, we want to encourage you to scale. And there are scale up companies. They're typically Series A and beyond. They've got some significant institutional capital, but they're going to need a lot more, most likely, to grow. They might also be revenue bootstrap companies that are doing really, really well and want to access new forms of investment, like, for example, venture debt. And a big shout out to Invest Victoria and the work that they're doing on the Venture Growth Fund to support those sorts of companies. So we definitely want to see those scale ups continue to grow. But we also recognize this is a system of failure, and many activated entrepreneurs may not be successful in getting a startup off the ground. Many startups may not be able to grow. Many scale ups may fail, but there's a rare few that become our unicorns, those large scale exits and billion-dollar companies that lead to large-scale exits, including IPOs and M&As. And of course, that is incredibly important for those founders and a great sign of success. But more importantly than that, it's a trigger back into the ecosystem. Creating unicorns is a massive impetus of growth for the sector, and it sets off a flywheel. What we know is that when unicorns are created and founders and executives earn a lot of cash as a result of their shareholding, it creates new investors who come to market and fund scale ups and startups. A great example is Paul Bassett at Square Peg Capital, who, off his success at Seek, founded Square Peg, one of our best venture capital firms. Another example is our own chair at LaunchVic, Lee Jasper, who has, after his exit at Aconex, has gone on to found Second Quarter Ventures. So those investors come back through the ecosystem, and they develop the ecosystem either through early stage investments, so becoming seed and angel investments and providing that first capital in, or by developing the local venture capital industry, those institutional investors that are going to help scale-ups grow, create jobs, and contribute to our prosperity. On the other hand, large-scale exits also produce talent, and they produce talent in the form of all those people that have been on that journey, from when it was a tiny company and there may have been less than 10 people, to all the way through to growing up to executive level, having many hundreds of staff and understanding all the pain points of those fast growth companies, working in a tech environment, leading a global business from here in Victoria. And so exits create new founders that go back into the ecosystem, and also experienced talent that are going to make those scale ups even more successful when they hire, because they're not repeating, they're coming in to repeat what they already know, not starting from scratch every time. And so unicorns are really important events for our ecosystem. And through these 4 avenues of activating entrepreneurs, supporting startups to grow, encouraging scale-up growth, and creating unicorns, our ecosystem is going to grow. So how are we doing? The answer is pretty well. We're now home to more than 2,100 startups, a continued growth trajectory, including through COVID. We recently produced at LaunchVic a report with Dealroom that showed that our homegrown Victorian startups have created over 40,000 jobs globally, and over 31,000 of them are located here in Victoria. In fact, our jobs growth rate is 10.75% over the last 2 years, including through COVID, which is a whopping number compared to what's happening in the rest of the economy. It shows how important this sector is to our future economy. This is the new jobs engine. Our startups are job multipliers, and we have a massive potential to impact our economy. The ecosystem is growing fast. The ecosystem in 2020 was valued at $7 billion, larger than the racing industry, the horse racing industry, and we're expecting to see an even bigger trajectory this year in 2020 when Startup Genome, who produce these figures globally for each ecosystem in the world, are going to produce the next results. Watch out for that result in late September. I think it's going to be exciting, and I suspect we'll see continued growth. Maybe not at the same rate because of what's happened through COVID, but we're certainly seeing growth, which is very exciting in the current environment. But perhaps the most exciting, having just spoken about unicorns and the importance of them as catalysts in the sector, it's important to point out that we are now home to 18 unicorns. So who are they? Here's our list of our unicorn leaders, and they're companies like a cloud guru who have to be congratulated on their $2 million exit, the largest exit we'd ever had, of course, shortly trumped by Afterpay, who have announced their takeover by Square at $39 billion. Extraordinary results for the ecosystem. And again, what we're seeing is these wonderful founders who are now in very privileged positions as a result of their incredible hard work and success that are going to contribute to make Victoria's ecosystem stronger, and indeed Australia's ecosystem stronger. The other unicorn I'd like to call out is Message Media, another exit earlier this year, hugely successful company. And again, those founders should be congratulated. I suspect many of you will know these other names that are up here. I won't list them all, but all wonderful companies that are doing great things for our startup ecosystem and our economy more broadly. So what has LaunchVic done? Well, to date, we've had we were founded in 2016, and since that time we've invested in over 126 programs to support founders and investors. We've activated over 108 million of private sector capital. The majority of that, about 90 odd million, is actually private sector capital that is flowing directly to startup companies that are supported by LaunchVic. So this is a company that might have attended one of our accelerator programs, through that program have managed to access capital. And so a great result for the sector that we're seeing such tremendous growth in private sector support for our startups. Our programs that we've put in place have helped over 500 startups to grow in scale. And in addition to that, we've helped nearly 5,000 entrepreneurs upskill so that they're ready to start their startup when they want to. On top of that, we do a lot of work around awareness and advocacy. We've run a number of campaigns, but perhaps most importantly, we've commissioned 15 research reports, which have helped us grow the knowledge that we need to grow the ecosystem and understand where intervention is needed and what we can do to support the sector to grow. So on to our strategy. So we're absolutely delighted that in July this year, we launched our new strategy. And as I said before, our purpose is to drive the long-term success of Victoria's startup sector. We have three goals. Very simply, we want to unlock investment capital. We want to make sure that our startups are supported and that there's enough capital in market to help them grow. We understand that this is a problem, and I'll come to this in more detail in one moment. But unlocking capital is really important because we can't create a bubble. We don't want to keep growing the number of startups in the state if there's just not the number of venture capital to support those startups to grow. So unlocking capital is critically important and is a key part of our strategy. This is a slight deviation from our previous strategies where we've been very focused on programs to support startups to grow, but nevertheless a very exciting development. We, of course, want more successful startups, and that means we want more startups in market. If we fail to produce startups in market, we're limiting the long-term potential of our ecosystem. It's really important that we recognize this as an ecosystem, and just as in a forest ecosystem, parts of the ecosystem sadly do fail, they die. They also create the nexus to be able to generate new growth. And so that's exactly what we need to make sure is happening in our ecosystem. We want to bring lots of startups to market. Unfortunately, not all of them are going to be successful. But in bringing startups to market, we're bringing more qualified founders into the market. And we know that second-time founders are more likely to be successful than first-time founders. So we have to continue to support more startups to be created. We also need to support more successful startups through their growth trajectory. We want to see a lower failure rate, and anything that we can do to help that reduce failure rate is really important. But let's be realistic. That failure rate is never going to go to zero, and nor should it. There are so many things that go into creating a successful startup. You need the right product, you need the right team, you need to be at the right time, and you also need a fair bit of luck along the way, let's face it. You need the right investors, you need to be able to have the right customers, particularly first customers that will help prove your value proposition and your product market fit. So there's lots of things that go into help those startups grow and be successful, and that's where we see ourselves playing. And then, of course, finally, creating high value jobs. And in many ways, that is the crux of why the Victorian government supports us. But we are supported as a sector because we're important to growing high value jobs. And we want to continue to see those jobs grow. That's grown in the context of new founders coming in, but also as those companies grow, they create high value jobs. And that's incredibly important for our economy. It's incredibly important for our own prosperity, and it's incredibly important for future generations' prosperity. So our three goals, to state it simply: unlock investment capital, more successful startups, and creating high value jobs. So how are we going to do this? Well, very briefly, and I'll deep dive into each of these areas in a moment. We want to catalyse early stage investments, and we have three ways in which we're doing this. One is we're supporting and indeed implementing the Victorian Startup Capital Fund. Two, we are delivering the Women's Angel Sidecar Fund, also known as the Alice Anderson Fund. And three, we are also taking a new approach to investing. Whereas LaunchVic previously has granted, and granting money means we're giving money away and expecting something to be done in return for that, we are now expecting, where appropriate, to generate a return on investment back into the ecosystem. So we recognize that there are a number of programs that we support where the people in the program, and indeed key persons, stand to benefit from those grants. So an example is an accelerator program that is taking equity in startups, and that equity is held by the company of which the beneficiaries are the team that run the company. We love that. We think that's great. We don't have a problem with that at all. It's the way the ecosystem works. But we do see that where government funds are used and people are able to profit off those funds, we should also be generating a return on investment for the benefit of the ecosystem. We want to pay it forward. We want the ecosystem to pay it forward. And so where possible, we want to generate a return on investment. A great example was our investment into StartMate. We absolutely love the team at StartMate. We love what they're doing. We certainly want to see them in Victoria, and we're very pleased that through our investments, we've managed to lure them down to Victoria, and indeed they've set up their head office here now in Victoria. We previously had granted StartMate funds to run their program, but now we've actually taken an investment. So in supporting them to come to Victoria, we've also invested in them. And so it's a win-win. StartMate are able to operate from Victoria, and we're able to generate a return on investment through their fund that will ultimately be returned to government and invested back into the Victorian economy, which is very exciting. The second part is more programs. So this is business as usual. We want to support founders, we want to support investors, we want to support talent, and we want to support government procurement. The four things that continue to get reported to us through the works and surveys that we do and the research that we do. So we will continue business as usual activities. Finally, we're also going to be driving awareness and advocacy. For those of you that know our Scale Up Your Career campaign to increase the number of talent in the ecosystem, we will continue to run campaigns like that. We're going to continue to advocate very strongly for the ecosystem. We are upping our ante in policy research. We want to play a more active role in influencing both state and federal policy that is going to be impacting the startup ecosystem. And we'll continue to do our research and ecosystem monitoring, and I'll come to that in a moment. So what are the KPIs that come out of this, and what do we care about? Well, ultimately, we care about how much investment is activated in Victoria. This is in some sense a proxy for the success of the ecosystem. We want to see that investment continue to be activated. We want investors to continue to do well. And ultimately, over a period of time, there should be no need for an entity like LaunchVic, because the private sector should be functioning so well that there are enough investors and there are enough startups to fuel the system and keep that flywheel going. This indeed has been the case in countries like Israel, but it did take 20 years to get to that point. So we certainly see investments activated as a proxy of that measure. Of course, we want to know how many startups there are in the ecosystem. We want to know how many jobs are creating through the work we do. We want to have a measure on return of investment. After all, we are running 2 funds. And finally, we want to make sure that we're increasing awareness. And I think awareness is something that LaunchVic has done pretty well within the sector, within the startup ecosystem. But we want to do more to encourage more people to be aware of what the benefits of the ecosystem are. And that goes back to startup creation. So I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive, and then I'm going to take some questions from the audience. So I'll just touch on all the priority areas in a little more detail. So please think about what questions you have, and I'll answer them when I get to the end of this presentation. First thing I want to touch on is the increasing early stage investment. And so what is fundamentally driving us here is a piece of work that we did back in 2018 with Startup Genome that showed that there was a real gap, and a very worrying gap, in early stage capital. It's actually something that happens in a lot of early stage ecosystem. It's certainly not unique to Victoria. What tends to happen is that as venture markets develop and early stage investing markets develop, or startup investing markets develop, you get new funds that come to market. And those funds are typically small, maybe tens of million, a couple of tens of million. But as time goes on, those funds can grow and become more successful. As they grow, they get interest from institutional investors. So super funds start investing. As those super funds start investing, those venture capital funds grow even bigger. And as they grow, they find it harder to make small investments. And so that is what we have seen in markets. So we see every year the venture capital industry is growing, and that's very exciting from a headline figure perspective. Last year, there was over 600 million invested into Victorian companies through venture, but 500 million of that was late stage capital, so Series B and beyond, fundraisers typically of tens of millions of dollars. And those deals go to a very small number of companies who get very large funding. So an example was Airwallex, who did a very successful raise not so long ago that was tens of millions of dollars. So that leaves a gap in early stage capital. And so what we are finding is that as we're growing the number of startups in the ecosystem, the early stage capital, seed investment, is flatlining. And that's a really big problem. It means that we are facing a lack of capital. And so what we've done is implement 2 funds to address this. One is very specifically targeted at women, and that's the Women's Angel Sidecar Fund, also known as the Alice Anderson Fund. And I'll give a big shout out to Rebecca Rosenschwag, our investment manager at LaunchVic, who is heading up the Alice Anderson Fund. Rebecca is speaking at 2 p.m. today on the fund. And for any female founders, I cannot recommend more strongly that you go to that. Learn how we are supporting you, and we really hope to see your applications to the fund. The way the Women's Sidecar Fund, the Alice Anderson Fund, is working is that the Victorian government has contributed $10 million to LaunchVic to operate the fund. We are co-investing 3-to-1 alongside angel investors. So an angel investor puts an application in because they've found a wonderful startup that they're going to invest in. If they put 300,000 into that investment, we'll bring another 100,000 to the table. The reason we're doing that is we want to increase the number of women who are getting access to capital. Not enough women are getting access to capital in market. There is a bias that takes place, both conscious and unconscious, and we want to address that. We want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to support our female founders to get access to capital. And if you want to find out more, call out again, 2 p.m. on Zoom with Rebecca Rosenschwag, our investment manager for the Alice Anderson Fund. So once those companies have got seed capital, they're going to want some Series A capital, most likely, the second investment. And that's where the Victorian Startup Capital Fund comes in. This is a piece of work that LaunchVic has been working on for some time in understanding what we can do to support the gap that we see in early stage capital. And we've done a lot of research on this. One thing that we very strongly believe is that government should not be directly investing into startups. There are many examples where this hasn't worked. There's a great book by Josh Lerner called The Boulevard of Broken Dreams. We've been very influenced by that. And we landed on a fund of funds as the appropriate model for investment. This is exactly what happened in Israel with Yozma, if anyone's followed that, or New Zealand with the New Zealand Investment Venture Fund. What we're doing here, Victorian government has committed $60 million to a fund of funds, and we are in market right now for a fund manager. We've just closed our RFP, and we're in the midst of assessing our potential fund manager. That fund manager will be responsible for raising another 60 million from private sector investors. So it's both public funds and private funds to lead to a $120 million fund of fund. That fund of funds invests in VC funds, underlying VC funds at early stage. So making seed investments, absolutely, but predominantly Series A investments, that first institutional capital. Those VC funds will receive funding from the VSCF. So let's say we have a $120 million fund of funds. We have 12 VC funds we invest in, each 10 million. Those VC funds have to match that 10 million with another 10 million at least. So that leads to 240 million. And that boosts the sector. Through this process, we see more startups getting funded, but we also imagine that new VC funds will come to market. So in this way, we're not just investing startups, but we're also building the sector. And as I said before, we don't want LaunchVic to be here forever. We recognize there's still a lot of work to do to grow this sector and make it sustainable. But ultimately, government should be able to back away when this private sector is working effectively. Part of that is making sure there are enough early stage investors in market. We're not quite there, but the Victorian Startup Capital Fund is certainly our first big intervention to help address this. And we expect to see new VC funds come to market. And that will mean that we're supporting the market to develop while also supporting those startups to access capital. So that's our first priority. Our second priority, as I mentioned before, is programs that are going to grow more scale up. So this is both working at catalyzing startup creation as well as supporting startups to scale. So to support and upskill founders, we're going to continue to run programs like pre-accelerators and accelerators and founder education programs. And I will give a big shout out to our next grant round, which was announced this morning. We're delighted to be partnering with Agriculture Victoria and the Minister for Agriculture and have launched a new grant round specifically targeting pre-accelerators focused on agtech, recognizing that agriculture is a really important part of Victoria's industry. But we also recognize that there aren't very many agtech startups in that sector. And so what we want to do is try to correct that imbalance and make sure that we are supporting our traditional industries to innovate. And so that is where our next grant round is targeted. It was launched this morning. For more information, go to the LaunchVic website. I know the team will be sharing links, and I'll also give a shout out to the information session on 22nd of September. More details will be available on our website. The team can share it through the chat function. If you're interested in agtech, you're interested in pre-accelerator programs, strongly encourage you to apply for to attend that information session. So that's very much business as usual for LaunchVic, and we'll continue to run these sorts of programs both at pre-accelerator, accelerator. We want to see new people come to market, new support programs to help founders get started and grow. But we also recognize that we've now supported 18 accelerator programs, for instance, and we don't want to keep bringing new accelerator programs to market. We actually also want to support those that are doing an awesome job. And there are a number that are truly blowing it out the park. So we'll also continue to refund those programs that are doing a really great job. Finally, we're always open to great ideas. There's a number of programs, for example, the VC Catalyst program that has come through a process where we were approached to ask if we would fund. If your program is unique, if it is highly aligned with our strategy, if we can justify why we don't go through a grants process, we're very interested in also doing unsolicited funding proposals. And that's something that is definitely, the door's open. So if you've got ideas that are absolutely fundamentally unique, we would be very interested in hearing from you for those. So the second area of Beyond Founders is supporting and educating investors. In a similar way, we are looking to provide programs that are going to educate investors. We see this as being critically important, and we acknowledge the phenomenal work, for example, of VC Catalyst program at the Wade Institute has done in unlocking capital, and tremendous results from a program that we have invested in. And we certainly want to continue to support the great investor education programs that are in market. But there's more work to do. And we recognize that particularly angel investing is not something that you just jump into. Just as if you're going to do share trading, you need to educate yourself on the tools and systems, you need to educate yourself on the market, you need to educate yourself on how to invest, how to manage your risks. You need to do that in the context of angel investing and indeed early stage VC investing. So there's a lot of work to do in this area, and this obviously then supports the indirectly the success of programs like the Alice Anderson Fund and the Victorian Startup Capital Fund. We also want to support talent. And we have been very focused on founders and investors, but we definitely have started to play in talent. We ran the Scale Up Your Career campaign a couple of years ago. We've also earlier this year launched a number of programs to support people who are interested in working in startups to develop the skills and find potential internships or indeed jobs. We see this as being a really important piece of work that we need to continue to do more in. Every time we survey startups and talk to startups, we hear about the talent shortages, the fact that they are really struggling to find particular roles. And it's not just tech talent, it's operational talent, it's back office support, etc. So there is clearly a lot of work to do, and we recognize the challenges that particularly scaling startups have around finding talent and the criticality of finding the right talent to help you grow. The final piece in this programs section is our Civic Labs program, and we always hear from startups when we survey about access to government procurement. We understand that those early customers, particularly large enterprises, including government, can be unbelievably powerful in a startup's success trajectory. Having a big customer like the Victorian government speaks volumes to the success of your startup as you start to move interstate or indeed international. We very successfully run the first Civic Labs program, but we're looking to ramp that up. We'll have more to say in later this year, but without a doubt, the Civic Labs program is sticking around. It's here to stay, but we want it to be bigger and better to support more startups to access opportunities. So the final area is driving awareness and advocacy, and we definitely want to keep doing our campaigns to raise awareness. Of course, we will continue to promote the programs we support and the ecosystem more broadly, but there are also specific campaigns that we want to do to really hone in on areas where we recognize that there are real challenges in the ecosystem, and we will have more to say on this as well. So campaigns, keep following us, keep recommending us to your friends, and please do get involved. We are here to talk about the ecosystem. LaunchVic is the startup agency, and we certainly have a voice here. But if we really want to raise the awareness of the ecosystem, we need to amplify, and we need to amplify each other. It's not just LaunchVic's voice talking. We need to make sure everyone in the sector is talking about how special this sector is, so that we are raising awareness in the broader economy, whether that be across different parts of government, whether that be across different parts of corporate Australia, or more broadly the community, encouraging startup creation. Raising awareness is incredibly important to continuing to drive that growth. We need new people coming into this sector, and so the more we can raise awareness together, the better. Policy and research, we have done a little bit of this, but for example, we're starting to do more work around policy. Our latest proposal that we're looking at is, for example, the early stage investment company scheme. We're very interested in how this is operating and believe that this scheme perhaps isn't being widely utilised in Victoria. So we want to do more to ensure that our startups are able to access schemes that are able to help them grow. And we also want to make sure those schemes have got the right settings, that there aren't impediments for people to be involved, and that we're not got regulatory red tape. So you will see us play a deeper role in research and advocacy, and policy research and advocacy. Finally, we also have our research and monitoring program, and we're very proud of the research that we've done and been able to really lead the way in driving what the ecosystem needs. And we thank everybody who's participated in the numerous research programs that we have undertaken. Each one of them contribute to the growth of the ecosystem in some way, shape or form. But perhaps one of the most important things that we've done is our work with Dealroom, and a big shout out to Grace Gibson. Many people may know Grace, who started as my executive assistant. She has a love of data and analytics and has now been promoted to our data and analytics lead. And she's giving a talk this afternoon at 3 o'clock on our database, making sure that we have the right data and that we are monitoring and actively updating that data is critically important to understanding the ecosystem. Also, having that tool is a really important tool for example, startups to be able to find investors that are appropriate to them, or investors trying to find startups. So that database is a great public resource. If anyone is interested in any aspect of the startup ecosystem, whether it's knowing how many startups there are in a particular area, or how many investors there are, what accelerator programs there are, I can't strongly encourage you enough to reach out and have a look at that database, Finding Startups at launchvic.org. And I would also encourage you to join Grace's session this afternoon to get a demo on how to use the database. So the final thing I'll say is, if you're looking for more support or information, we're certainly here to help. Please reach out to us through our website, through hello@launchvic.org, through Twitter, through LinkedIn, and of course through our Finding Startups database. And so thank you very much for everyone for joining us today. Really very excited to be presenting LaunchVic strategy. We've got a big 3 years ahead. One final thing I'll say is that in addition to our strategy, we are growing the LaunchVic team. You'll see a number of new faces. I'd like to particularly call out Georgia McDonald, who is our Chief Operating Officer and will be leading a lot of the programmatic work that we do. Anthony Fadoulis, our new CFO, and Rebecca Pert, who is our grants manager. Many people would know Kat Franks. Kat has sadly moved on from LaunchVic, and I'd like to acknowledge all her great work. But we're now ably supported by Anthony and Rebecca, who will become very well known to very many of you, I am sure. And Kate Giddings has stepped back up into the General Manager of Marketing and Communication. She was in that role prior to her maternity leave, and I'd like to thank Kirili Davis for all the work that she did to ably hold that portfolio. We now have Kate back in that role. One final position that we'll be supporting soon is a general manager of startups who will be reporting to Georgia McDonald. And that's really bringing some deep startup expertise into LaunchVic. So along with the rest of the team, there's many of us, we're on the website, we're all here, we're all deeply passionate about growing our startup ecosystem, and we can't encourage you to reach out enough. So on that, I'm going to turn my attention to Q&A. Please feel free to send through questions. And the first one is Amanda Durham. Is there a plan to support advanced manufacturing to build on the traditional strength of Victoria? So Amanda, thanks for your question. The strengths of where LaunchVic has focused in sectoral areas has really been very much focused on where our strengths actually are. So 1 in 5 startups are focused in health tech, and many of you will know that we've had a grants program specifically dedicated to health tech and supporting that ecosystems and the gaps that are very unique to health techs. For example, the fact that they're working with regulated industries, they have longer investment timeframes. Most of our programs are generalist. And so where we do specialist sectors is where we see that there is a large number of startups already that need support, or as in the case with AgTech, where we've partnered with government to address a particular challenge. So in the case of AgTech, we've actually worked with Agriculture Victoria, who are providing 2.2 million to support this work. So LaunchVic's bringing its startup expertise to the table. The AgVic team are bringing the agriculture expertise to the table, and we're doing that in partnership with government. So in short, we don't have a specific plan for advanced manufacturing because we see that many of our programs do actually provide much of the support that startups need, including advanced manufacturing. However, we're definitely open to conversations about something dedicated, and that would be something that we would most likely work very closely with the Victorian government to understand how we can grow the sector. At this stage, advanced manufacturing is not a deep strength of the Victorian ecosystem compared to, example, health tech, which accounts for 1 in 5 startups. So I hope that answers your question. We've got a question from Antonio, which is just jumped around. The question is, what types of job, full-time or part-time? That's in relation to the fact that we have 31,000 jobs in Victoria, over 40,000 globally. They are a combination of full-time and part-time and casual. What they exclude is gig worker economy. So there is definitely a combination, but we are seeing growth across the board in jobs because these companies are growing. So there are many full-time jobs, for example, that are growing. The valuation, the $7 billion valuation, is actually from startup Genome. They do an ecosystem valuation report every year. I strongly encourage you to look at their reports. They produce them. They're freely accessible on their website. Their ecosystem valuation is specifically targeting the value of early stage startups. So they estimate the number of startups in the sector and the valuation of those startups. They produce their report annually, and the report goes into the details of how they work out that valuation. But simplistically, it's looking at companies that are less than 10 years old and the valuations that they've achieved through, for example, capital raises. I'm going to throw a similar question is again from Antonio to share the reference of the $7 billion evaluation. I can see that Kate Gittings has, from our General Manager of Marketing Communications, has shared that link. I might ask Kate to also put that in the chat function so that everyone can see that, just in case you can't see the Q&A. Caitlin has asked if there are any activities going to connect and share ideas with best practices with other startup ecosystems. The answer is absolutely. We work very closely with Startup Genome and their global membership. We meet with them very frequently across a range of different ecosystems, and also through their member meetings where we share learnings with each other. So for us, we follow ecosystems globally in the US, in the UK, Israel, Europe, New Zealand, Asia, and we regularly catch up with them through particular Startup Genome. I'd also like to give a shout out to our counterparts in other states, in New South Wales, South Australia, Queensland government, who are also all doing very similar jobs in driving startup ecosystems, and we work with them. And we also work with the federal government, particularly on there's a working group that's been set up by the federal government to discuss issues relating to the startup sector. So we are very active in those discussions, and we proudly represent Victoria in those discussions. The last question is from Robert. For those startups that are seeking to solve a government service problem, how does LaunchVic help them beyond the original proof of concept phase when they have to go through government procurement processes, where they are at risk of losing IP they've developed, which is then form part of the RFP scope brief? To be honest with you, the second part is unique to, is something that is, might vary. We certainly don't offer RFPs where we're looking to take IP off startups, and nor do we advocate for that. The first part of the question around how do we support startups to gain access to government procurement is very much through Civic Labs, and I encourage you to have a look at the Civic Labs website to see the work that we do there. As I said, we are re-looking at that. It's been a very successful program, but we also recognize that there's a hell of a lot more that we can do in that space. And we're working very closely with, in particular, the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions to really think about what we can do to supercharge that program to help startups gain access to government procurement opportunities. And we will have more to say on that in the not too distant future. So that is the end of the startups for the questions. If there are any more, please shoot them through. I am more than happy to stay online for a few minutes to be able to answer those questions. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but please do feel free to ask any more questions. I'll hang around for a few more minutes. Thank you again for your time. If there are any that come through, I'll answer them. Otherwise, we wish you all the very best through whatever lockdown you may or may not be in. We know we've got friends from interstate joining us today who are lucky enough not to be in lockdown. But for those Victorians, we wish you all the best at this difficult time, but know that the startup sector is here to support you. And what's more, it is going to change our economy into the future and create a very exciting future for the Victorian economy. So we wish you all the best in your endeavours and look forward to working with you over the next few years. Thank you very much, everybody, as you drop off. Really, really appreciate you making the time to hear from us today. We've got a question from Stuart for those that remain on the line. Stuart, the LaunchVic is not responsible agency in Victoria for bringing startups to the state, but there is certainly a lot of support across the Victorian government, in particular InvestVic, who we work very closely with. So we do tend to refer startups that are looking to move to Victoria to InvestVic to help with that. So if you do have a startup in mind and you are looking for support, please feel free to send us some details through hellolaunchvic.org and we'll make sure that you're connected with the right people. On that note, I think we've got the very last question through, so I am going to stop sharing and we will end the session. Thank you very much, everybody.